Welcome back to The Explainer. Okay, today we are tackling something huge, literally one of the most profound debates in human history, how we actually know what we know. For decades, we've basically been sold this false dichotomy, you know the one. On one side, you have cold, hard science. On the other, fuzzy, mysterious intuition. And we're always told we have to pick a team. But what if I told you that treating these two things as enemies completely misses the point? Today, we're going to deconstruct our mind's incredible epistemic toolkit, the actual tools we use to build knowledge, and see how these different modes of knowing are actually supposed to work together.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll start with the Hall of Superstitions, look at science versus scientism, open up the mind's epistemic toolkit, compare discovery with justification, cross the knowledge communication gap, and finally wrap up by recalibrating our confidence.
Section 1. The Hall of Superstitions. Is science the only route to knowledge? Let's dive right into this with a story. Picture a character named Nokowadi. He's at this modern scientific gathering that a wise man refers to as the Hall of Superstitions. Why? Because, as the wise man points out, many people there treat science like a fanaticism, the absolute singular window through which to view everything in the universe. He uses his brilliant metaphor to explain the problem. He says, if the world is a magic trick, it is in the hands of a magician. Science can show us how a magician can perform his tricks, but it cannot show us why these tricks are fascinating. This hits the nail on the head regarding the limits of empirical description. Science is phenomenal at explaining the how, the gears, the physics, the biology, but it doesn't automatically hand us the meaning, the beauty, or the ultimate why behind the human experience.
So the absolutely crucial takeaway here is this. Science is a tool. It's an unbelievably reliable, powerful tool for sure, but it is not absolute truth. Expecting empirical science to independently tell us the meaning of life or humanity's ultimate purpose, that is a total trap. It's basically asking a tool to do a job it was never built to do.
Moving to Section 2. Science versus scientism, defining the boundaries.
To really grasp this, we have to draw a hard line. We need to completely separate science from scientism. Science is a disciplined, totally revisable method that relies on observation, models, and testing. It's fantastic. Scientism, on the other hand, isn't actually science at all. It's a philosophical overextension. It's this rigid, dogmatic belief that if a question can't be answered by a lab test right this second, it's an illegitimate or totally meaningless question. But here's the thing. Recognizing the limits of a method doesn't weaken it. Defining exactly where a tool is reliable is literally the hallmark of good, disciplined inquiry.
And that brings us to a major pitfall known as epistemic extrapolation. This happens whenever we take a method that's perfectly valid in one specific area and just stretch it way, way beyond its actual competence. It's this very human tendency to take a highly successful system and try to turn it into an absolute universal system for everything. When we do this with science, it warps from a method of inquiry into pure dogmatism.
Which brings us to Section 3, the mind's epistemic toolkit. Feeling, intuition, and reasoning.
Okay, so if science isn't the only tool in the shed, what else are we working with? We have this incredibly diverse epistemic toolkit, and it's fascinating how neatly we can map different types of human questions to entirely different tools. Think about it. If you want to know what happens, boom, you use observation and science. But what if you're asking, what ought we to do? Now you need ethics. Sure, science can inform your ethics with empirical facts, but it can't make that final moral judgment for you. And if you're asking about beauty or the purpose of existence, now you're reaching into aesthetics, art, philosophy, and theology. You simply need different tools for different jobs.
Now, let's talk about feeling for a second. Historically, we've always pitted feeling against reason, right? Like our emotions just exist to ruin our perfect logic. But modern neuroscience says, actually scratch that, that's completely backwards. Feeling actively participates in cognition. When something happens in the world, our feelings provide an instant affective evaluation. They assign salience, which is a fancy way of saying they tell our brain, hey, pay attention, this is important or surprising or dangerous. That salience is what drives our focus. Without feelings like curiosity, surprise, or even a sense of aesthetic wonder, a scientist might literally never find the motivation to start an investigation in the first place.
So human understanding is really this dynamic continuum. It starts when we sense and perceive the world. Then we feel something, maybe a spark of surprise at a weird anomaly. Next, our intuition kicks in, non-consciously combining all our past experiences and memories to hand us a sudden hunch. Then we use explicit reasoning to map out the logic of that hunch.
And finally, we apply external testing, the scientific method, to see if our internal model actually matches reality. It's this beautiful recursive loop. A hunch gets tested, becomes a theory, and that new theory generates entirely new sensations and fresh curiosities.
Section 4. Discovery versus justification. Where ideas come from versus how we validate them.
This dynamic loop we just talked about leads to a massive revelation about how human progress actually happens. We have to draw a really sharp distinction between the origin of an idea, the discovery, and how we ultimately validate it, the justification. The creative origin of a claim does not equal its validation. Science doesn't need to completely suppress your wild intuition or your crazy bursts of inspiration. It just needs to rigorously test whatever those intuitions spit out.
Seriously, just think about where some of the greatest scientific hypotheses in history came from. They definitely don't always come from a sterile spreadsheet. They spring from analogies, lucky accidental discoveries, leaps of visual imagination, an aesthetic preference for a really elegant math equation, or even a sudden insight during a dream. The messy, creative, non-rational generation of a hunch is a 100% valid origin story, but the origin doesn't determine the scientific validity.
Which forces us to face a harsh but necessary reality check. Subjective certainty is not the same thing as objective reliability. Look, you might have an incredibly powerful intuition or a profound spiritual illumination that makes you feel absolutely unconditionally certain about a fact. But that intense internal feeling, it isn't external evidence. A revelation might feel completely certain on the inside, but to claim it as a universal, objective fact out in the world, it absolutely has to pass through the external constraints of reasoning and testing.
Section 5. The knowledge-communication gap. Can true knowledge become poisonous?
All right, let's shift gears. What happens when we finally have validated knowledge and we try to share it with the world? Can true knowledge ever actually become poisonous? You hear this argument sometimes, that handing complex facts to non-experts is inherently dangerous. But a conclusion itself isn't poisonous. The danger is all about how that knowledge is framed. Real knowledge is never just a single, isolated fact. It's an entire domain. It comes bundled with the method used to find it, its strict range of validity, its boundary conditions, and critically, its degree of uncertainty.
The real villain here is decontextualization. See, a specialist understands a proposition perfectly because they hold all the assumptions, all the uncertainties, and all the exceptions right there in their mind. But when they communicate it to the general public, they often just hand over the bare proposition. And when you strip a heavily qualified, probabilistic scientific result of its vital context, it transforms into a dangerous, absolute statement in the mind of the person receiving it.
We really have to remember that communication is not a file transfer. A listener doesn't just download a speaker's knowledge into their brain. They have to reconstruct the meaning using their own existing memories, feelings, and biases. So it stands to reason. The greater the interpretive distance between the expert's background and the listener's background, the greater the need for thorough contextual explanation.
So how do we fix this gap? I can tell you what the solution isn't. It's not secrecy, censorship, or intellectual gatekeeping. The only proper response to a knowledge gap is to construct intermediate conceptual bridges. Good communication doesn't just dumb things down. It carefully preserves the boundaries and the uncertainties while building a bridge of explanatory scaffolding so the receiver can reconstruct the truth accurately for themselves.
Finally, Section 6. Recalibrating our confidence. The true meaning of superstition.
As we bring No-Cody's journey to a close, we need to completely redefine a word we all thought we understood: superstition. Superstition isn't just about avoiding black cats or worrying about broken mirrors. A much broader and frankly much more accurate definition is this: whenever the confidence you assign to a belief vastly outweighs the epistemic reliability of the process supporting it, you have officially entered the danger zone of superstition.
Think about it. When we lose our boundary conditions, every single mode of knowing gets corrupted. Take science, overextend it philosophically, and you get scientism. Take intuition, overextend it, and you start seeing false patterns everywhere. Take pure reason, start with false premises, and you end up with a highly rigorous but completely systematic error. Take a deeply subjective spiritual experience, try to enforce it as external certainty, and you get pure dogmatism. The problem is never the tools themselves. It's the loss of calibration between the claims we make and the evidence we actually have.
Which leaves us with the ultimate takeaway from the Hall of Superstitions. True intellectual maturity isn't about rejecting intuition for science or rejecting science for spirituality. It's about knowing exactly what each tool in your mental toolkit does best and knowing when it's time to put one down and pick up another. So as you go out into the world today and evaluate your own deepest beliefs, I want you to ask yourself honestly, Is your confidence truly calibrated to your evidence? Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.